There were 7 names George Harrison carried like scars. Not rivals, not critics, but people he would never forgive for betrayals that cut deeper than fame itself. To the world, he was the quiet, gentle Beatle, the soft-spoken one with the soulful eyes. But behind that calm exterior, Harrison harbored a private list of grudges, etched in bitterness. Some were friends who mocked him, others idols who disappointed him, and one shockingly tied to the dark powder of Hollywood's backstage scene. So who exactly made it onto George Harrison's list of the unforgiven? George Harrison was born on February 25th, 1943, in Liverpool, to a working-class family. Music wasn't just entertainment in the Harrison household, it was lifeblood. His mother's passion for songs gave George an early compass, and soon he revealed a natural talent for guitar. By 16, he had left school, apprenticing as an electrician, before fate pulled him into a small band called the Quarrymen in 1960. No one could have predicted that this modest beginning would set him on the road to becoming one of the Fab Four, and a legend in music history. On stage, George was different from the others. Where John and Paul dominated with charisma and wit, George stood grounded, serious, focused, and quiet. It earned him the press nickname the Quiet Beatle, and that title stuck even more fiercely after one pivotal moment. Just days before the Beatles' groundbreaking appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show, Harrison was struck with a severe throat infection. Doctors ordered complete silence until the performance. And so, when the curtain finally rose, America saw a young guitarist whose stillness radiated mystery. It became the beginning of an image that haunted him for the rest of his career. But make no mistake, quiet did not mean submissive. On tour, George's calm personality often clashed with the louder, more domineering energy of his bandmates. The friction grew worse as his songwriting matured. Even when he poured heart and soul into his music, George was allowed only 2 or 3 songs per album. Each rejection, each B-side felt like another wound. The resentment began to fester, and over time it hardened into grudges that would last a lifetime. The first name on Harrison's list was one that shocked even his closest friends, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the man who had once lit a fire in George's young heart, only to leave him disillusioned years later. It all began in the early 1950s. George was just a Liverpool teenager pedaling his bike through the neighborhood when a sound spilled out of a nearby house, Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Just a few notes, but to George it felt like lightning had struck. In that instant, music was no longer background noise, it was destiny. Harrison later recalled, "When I first heard Elvis, I knew I was never going to be the same again." Through his youth, George worshiped Presley. The voice, the guitar slung low, the rebellious swagger. Elvis embodied freedom, everything the young Beatles wanted to channel into their own music. For George, Elvis was proof that rock and roll could change the world. But when Harrison finally met his idol in the 1970s, the dream crumbled. The once revolutionary figure now stood in a glittering white jumpsuit, surrounded by trumpet blasts, female backup singers, and Vegas glitz. To George, it wasn't rebellion anymore. It was theater. Afterward, Harrison confided to friends, "I just wanted to tell him, put on some jeans, a black shirt, drop the backup singers and the trumpets, and just play 'That's All Right, Mama,' like you used to." The remark didn't stay private for long. Word traveled back to Elvis. According to those close to him, Presley gave a cold smile and muttered, "If he thinks I'm going back to little bars just to please somebody, then he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley." From that moment, distance grew. For Harrison, it was heartbreak. The purity of rock and roll had vanished. For Elvis, it was insult. A kid from England, daring to question the king at the height of his Vegas reign. And that clash of admiration turned bitterness carved the first name into George's silent list of 7. If Elvis was the shattering of an idol, the next name on Harrison's list cut even closer to the bone, Paul McCartney. Not a distant hero, but a brother who became a rival. Their story began in the most ordinary way. 2 boys on the same bus to school. Paul was older, confident, already obsessed with music. George, shy but eager, carried his guitar everywhere. They'd sit side by side, trading chords, working out songs until their fingers ached. McCartney often called him his kid brother. For a while, that bond was unshakable. Together with Lennon, they pushed the Beatles into a force that would rewrite music history. But by the late 1960s, under the blinding spotlight of fame, cracks began to show. The release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band in 1967 marked a turning point. The album was hailed as a masterpiece, but Paul's creative dominance was undeniable. Slowly, George found himself boxed in, allowed just 2 or 3 tracks per album. Brilliant songs were sidelined, cut, or buried on the B-side. For a songwriter desperate to be heard, the sting was unbearable. By the time the Abbey Road sessions rolled around in 1969, the tension had reached boiling point. Paul, ever the perfectionist, tried to reshape George's compositions, but Harrison refused to yield. McCartney later admitted, almost grudgingly, "The trouble is, I always thought our songs were better than George's, but now his are at least as good as ours." George didn't mince words either. "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. That's the truth. I respect Paul. He's a great bass player, but sometimes he's just too overpowering." The rivalry spilled into interviews. In 1974, Harrison told BBC Radio flatly, "Paul has ruined me as a guitar player." Yet even in bitterness, there was still a strange thread of brotherhood. Years later, George admitted, "No matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together." But with John Lennon, things were far harsher. What started as admiration soon soured into contempt, leaving wounds that George never let heal. While the world fixated on the Lennon-McCartney rivalry, a quieter but equally bitter battle simmered in the shadows. George Harrison and John Lennon. In the beginning, George admired John. Lennon was witty, daring, full of creative fire, everything a teenage guitarist looked up to. Their bond seemed strong as the Beatles clawed their way up from sweaty clubs to global stardom. But as the fame grew, so did John's dominance and George's frustration. Even as Harrison matured into a songwriter of his own, Lennon rarely disguised his indifference. When George presented new material, John would shrug dismissively. Once, after George nervously played him a demo, Lennon said bluntly, "It's fine, but it's not something I'd listen to." For a man already fighting for scraps of space on Beatles records, those words cut deep. As the years wore on, their friendship frayed. Lennon openly mocked George's spiritual journey, his immersion in Indian music, meditation, and mysticism. During one tense session, as George tried to explain the meaning behind a lyric, John snapped, "Don't start telling me about those Indian saints again." The contempt was like acid burning through what little warmth remained. By the Beatles' final years, George and John's interactions were clipped, cold, and distant. Harrison later admitted Lennon could be selfish, even cruel at times, and in his memoir I, Me, Mine, George nearly erased John altogether, his name appearing only in passing. When asked why, Harrison simply smiled and said, "Some things don't need to be mentioned." That silence said more than words ever could. When Lennon was murdered in 1980, George mourned, but he never sugarcoated the past. He acknowledged the loss, yet he refused to rewrite history. The wounds had been too deep, the respect too often withheld. John Lennon had begun as an idol to George Harrison, but by the end, he was a thorn in his side, a presence that stifled rather than inspired. And while John had mocked George's spirituality, the next name on Harrison's list would be dismissed not for beliefs, but for something far simpler, a voice he couldn't stand. George Harrison was known as the quiet Beatle, but in truth, his silence was selective. When he chose to speak, his words could cut like a blade. And in 1992, one of those blades was aimed straight at fellow rock legend Neil Young. It happened during a casual recording session with Bob Geldof. Someone asked George what he thought of Young. Harrison didn't hesitate. "I'm not a Neil Young fan. I hate it. Yeah, I can't stand it." The room froze. George wasn't finished. "The main thing is his voice. I like a couple of his songs, but I hate that voice worse than mine." For an artist to attack another's voice, the very core of their identity, was no small thing. And George didn't stop at words. He picked up a guitar and mocked Neil Young's soloing style right there in the studio, exaggerating the jagged notes before sneering, "It's just laughable." He does a solo in the middle of a song, and I look at Eric Clapton and say, "What's that about?" That same year, fate forced the two men to share a stage at Bob Fest, the 30th anniversary concert celebrating Bob Dylan. Dozens of icons gathered, but backstage, the air between Harrison and Young was icy. George avoided him, barely making eye contact. Neil Young, though, wasn't blind to the tension. Journalists reported he'd already heard about Harrison's harsh words, yet instead of firing back, Neil shrugged it off. In interviews, he spoke warmly of the Beatles. They changed everything. I'll always be grateful they opened doors for all of us. When asked directly about George's dislike, Neil replied calmly, "Everyone's entitled to an opinion. I didn't like certain artists when I first heard them either. Time changes how you see things." On stage that night, Neil stood close to George, smiling and singing as if nothing had happened. Harrison, for his part, kept it professional. No warmth, no spark, just duty to the crowd. For George, it wasn't always about talent. Sometimes it was about sincerity. And with the next name on his list, that question of sincerity cut even deeper. If George Harrison could forgive a weak voice, he could never forgive what he saw as falsehood. And that's exactly why Pete Townshend, guitarist of The Who, earned a place on his silent blacklist. The late 1960s were an era drenched in counterculture, peace signs, flower power, and the search for spiritual truth. For Harrison, this wasn't fashion, it was sacred. Music and spirituality weren't separate lanes, they were one road. And to walk, it required absolute sincerity. Townshend, meanwhile, was at the height of his fame. His thunderous guitar playing and stage theatrics had made the Who icons. But it was their rock opera Tommy that cemented Pete's reputation as a spiritual spokesman. He spoke publicly about the teachings of Mayor Baba, preaching peace, compassion, enlightenment. But Harrison didn't buy it. To him, Townshend was wearing spirituality like a costume. In a 1966 interview with India Today, George fired a direct shot. "Townshend? Every time I've met him, he's been stoned, talking rubbish. I don't think he's serious about all that religion stuff." To George, this wasn't just a difference of belief, it was betrayal. Using spirituality as theater cheapened something he held sacred. And beneath that tension, another wound simmered. Pete had quietly encouraged Eric Clapton's pursuit of Pattie Boyd, Harrison's first wife, the muse behind Clapton's anguished masterpiece Layla. Though George never publicly condemned Townshend for it, it's hard to imagine the betrayal didn't leave scars. This feud wasn't about who played better guitar or sold more records. It was a war of authenticity. Harrison fought for purity in music and soul, while Townshend, in George's eyes, blurred sacred truth with rock spectacle. For Harrison, the stage lights and roaring crowds could never excuse pretense. He wanted music to illuminate, not imitate, and when he felt someone strayed, he didn't hold back. Yet as the decades rolled on, new stars emerged, bands hailed as the next Beatles. One in particular seemed destined to inherit their crown, but to George, their swaggering frontman was nothing more than excess baggage. By the 1990s, a new wave of British music was dominating the charts, Britpop. And at the center of it all stood Oasis, hailed by fans and the press as the heirs to the Beatles' throne. To many, it felt like destiny, a torch passing from one generation of legends to the next. But George Harrison wanted nothing to do with it. In 1996, during an interview with Independent Radio News, Harrison was asked about Oasis and their outspoken frontman, Liam Gallagher. His response was as cold as it was cutting. "He seems a bit out of date and rather silly." And then came the knockout blow. "I think it's been proven. When you see the band without him holding a microphone, he's just excess baggage." For a band whose identity revolved around Liam's swagger and voice, it was a brutal dismissal. George wasn't just rejecting the comparisons between Oasis and the Beatles, he was rejecting the hype that surrounded them entirely. He doubled down the following year in an interview with Le Figaro in France. His verdict was short and sharp, and they were not very interesting. For Liam Gallagher, being insulted by a Beatle wasn't something he could swallow quietly. On MTV News, he snapped back, "I still love the Beatles, but personally, I think he's a clown. If I saw him, I'd tell him straight. A proper clown." The insults didn't stop there. Liam accused George of being the one truly out of touch. "He just reads the papers. He's the one who's out of date." And just like that, what could have been a symbolic handshake between generations became a public feud. Oasis throwing jabs at a Beatle, and George swatting away their legacy as hollow hype. But not all of Harrison's grudges were about ego or competition. One, perhaps the most complicated of all, involved a man he sometimes called a friend, but whose music he dismissed as cookie cutter, and whose lifestyle forced George to deliver one of the bluntest wake-up calls of his life. In the tabloids, George Harrison and Elton John often appeared side by side, performing together, laughing at parties, photographed like old friends. But the truth was far messier. Behind the polite smiles, there was tension, disappointment, and blunt honesty that few dared to voice. In 1976, during an interview, Harrison dropped a line that stunned even seasoned journalists. Elton John's music is something I've never thought much of. Every song sounds the same. I think he wrote one good song many years ago. The rest is just formula. Throw in some lyrics, 4 chords, shake it up, and you've got another Elton John mega hit. It wasn't playful banter, it was a surgical strike at the core of Elton's craft. A man at the peak of global fame being reduced to a cookie cutter hitmaker. Remarkably, Elton didn't retaliate. He never fired insults back at George, never lashed out in the press. Years later, he even spoke of Harrison with reverence. He was the wise man of the Beatles. He found something more valuable than fame. But Elton's memoir, Me, revealed a more complex truth. At one party, amid the chatter and flashing cameras, George leaned in, looked Elton dead in the eye, and said, "For God's sake, cut down on that marching powder." No one else in the room dared to say it, not colleagues, not so-called friends. But George, the man who had publicly dismissed Elton's music, was also the one who cared enough to confront him about his drug use, not as a rival, but as someone who genuinely wanted him to survive. That contradiction defined their relationship, cold yet caring, distant yet brutally honest. Elton later admitted he never forgot that moment, not the sting of George's critiques, nor the rare sincerity in his warning. In a world of glamorous parties and empty flattery, Harrison refused to play the game. He spoke his truth, whether it built walls or saved lives. 7 names, 7 scars. Some born from betrayal, others from disillusionment. But each one revealed a George Harrison far more complex than the quiet Beatle the world thought they knew.